Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first webinar on medical, how to achieve accuracy in medical journalism. I'm just checking that our speakers are all here. So if you can, please just switch your cameras on Mark, Kyle, Kirsten, and Natasha. Kyle, did you manage to get in? Sorry, I'm not sure where the other two speakers are. Hold on a second. Unfortunately, Carl, for some reason, is having problems getting into the meeting. So, Christelle, I'm going to send you, I think you have Carl's number. If you can just liaise with her while we go ahead, if you can try and get her on board. Thank you. So today,
Will do.
You're on.
Yes, I'll reach out to them. Don't worry.
Okay, thank you, Christelle.
No problem.
Okay. Sorry about that. So we came up with this series due to our increasing concerns about the levels of medical misinformation in the public domain and recognizing the important role that journalists and the media play in giving public access to accurate medical information. So this series is primarily for journalists and journalism students to learn more about how to ensure accuracy in medical reporting. So we hope you'll learn the skills for interrogating medical misinformation and also the sources who are sharing information. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our today's speakers, which is Mark Haywood, who will be highlighting the damage done in South Africa due to medical misinformation and disinformation. Prof. Carl Dunkel, who will be going into how to interrogate sources of information, and Kirsten Crosser, who will giving us some hot tips on how to fact check medical information. And thereafter, Dr. Natasha Antwerpen will talk to us about her work in constructive medical journalism. I'm sure many of us already know Mark Haywood due to his illustrious career in human rights and health advocacy, and especially with the AIDS Law Project. Mark, please, can you go ahead with your talk?
Great. Thank you, Rebecca, and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for holding this, I think, timely and necessary webinar on the question of the impact of medical misinformation in post-apartheid South Africa. I think my job as the opening speaker is probably to set the historical context for this discussion, speaking as an activist who was involved in the campaign for access to antiretroviral treatment 25 years ago, but also as an activist who has lived through the subsequent years of both AIDS denialism and COVID disinformation. So what I'm going to do to try and paint the picture is really speak to 5 headings. First of all, I just want to make a few comments about the context in which I think we must discuss medical misinformation, and I want to add the term disinformation to the title of this webinar. Secondly, I'm going to talk about disinformation in the AIDS epidemic in South Africa. Thirdly, disinformation in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then to say a few words about everyday misinformation and disinformation about health and medicine, i.e. to talk not just to the most extreme examples of the consequences of fake news and disinformation, but to suggest that this is an everyday problem that we should be paying more attention to. And I want to conclude, which is why I started by saying I think this is a timely webinar, by suggesting that we are facing new threats in relation to medical information and making some proposals about how we should be preparing to counter those threats, both as journalists, but also as people in society and as health activists. So let me start just by setting the context. Obviously, medical misinformation is as old as medicine. But I think what we have seen in the 21st century is an escalation, an exponential increase in misinformation and disinformation about medicine and health, which has assumed pandemic proportions. In fact, the WHO, I don't know if the WHO coined the term, but they now use the language about an infodemic, and we talk about the epidemiology of mis and disinformation. But I think to understand and to address this situation, we have to talk not just about the symptoms and the outward manifestations of medical misinformation, but also about the underlying causes that are driving this phenomena. And I would suggest that there are a number of causes, and several of them are directly related to what is happening within the profession of journalism and within the media. Most obviously this is a time of distrust of public institutions, including expressed distrust of the so-called mainstream and traditional media. That reflects an alienation of people from politics and from political institutions. It's also a time when there is substantial fear, but also generally a low quality of informed public discourse, which in itself is tied to the emasculation of the mainstream media, the hemorrhaging, the loss of journalistic jobs as a phenomena globally that is contributing to new inequalities in access to quality information at the very same time as there is a democratization, if you like, of access to information through social media. And that links me to the third point about context, which is just that the anarchy in relation to social media, the lack of regulation and the lack of public understanding about how social media works and about its algorithms. I think we have to see in this discussion that medical misinformation is not just a threat in itself, but to the extent that it implicates the digital media and social media itself is often a public health threat in our current context. So turning from those broad points to some more specific points in relation to health. As I said at the outset, we've titled this discussion about medical misinformation, but I think we have to understand that medical misinformation is when false information or wrong information is passed on between people inadvertently and feeds upon lack of knowledge and understanding. And we have to distinguish that from disinformation, which is the deliberate construction of false information, of wrong information, and the peddling of that information in order to serve particular agendas. And if we're going to tackle misinformation and disinformation in relation to health, we have to make that distinction. I also think that we have to make a further distinction, which is between free speech, opinion, and debate about health issues and about medicine, and dangerous disinformation, which transgresses a line and poses a direct risk of harm because of its impact on people's behaviors. And linked to that, as we have this discussion, it is necessary for journalists and activists to try to better understand the architecture of mis and disinformation. I think it's important for us to understand why, to many people, disinformation appears so persuasive and so appealing, and why it is not immediately written off or discredited by the people who receive this information. And in my experience, that is because of the fact that it is quite skillfully constructed, frequently, that it is based on pseudoscience, half-truths, which are repackaged and represented out of context as truths, and that it is often spread by people who outwardly, at least, appear to have influence and to have knowledge and expertise in some of the subjects in which they are speaking. And that disinformation fills a gap where there is increasing trust, distrust issues, and limited access to health professionals. And the final thing I would say, just in opening, is a challenge to all of us, which is how we respond to misinformation and disinformation determines very much whether people who are vulnerable to this information listen to us and change opinions and seek real knowledge, or whether they are cemented into false positions. So I want to suggest those as just some opening thoughts, and turn now to what has happened in South Africa over the last 25 years. And obviously, I want to start by talking about the HIV epidemic in South Africa, and recognizing that with the 25 years that have passed since the height of medical misinformation and disinformation in relation to AIDS, that I would imagine that there are many people who have either forgotten what happened in the early 2000s or who have not been taught what happened in the early 2000s. So allow me just to quickly take you back to the late 1990s, when South Africa was in the grip of a rapidly growing HIV epidemic, which had not yet crossed the threshold into the AIDS epidemic, i.e. most people were asymptomatic. But there was extensive public discussion around HIV, and there was also extensive stigma. And the first instance of misinformation occurred in 1997, when the South African cabinet, after meeting with a group of researchers, announced that a miracle cure had been found to treat AIDS, to cure AIDS, as they put it at the time, with a drug that was called Viridine. And the cabinet held a special press briefing to make this announcement, and there's, of course, substantial public interest. There isn't time to go into the Viridine scandal, except to say that 2 years later, it morphed into the beginnings of what we call AIDS denialism in South Africa, when in 1999, President Thabo Mbeki began to question the efficacy of antiretroviral medicines as treatment for AIDS, but took his questioning even further than suggesting that these medicines were toxic and dangerous to people, and saying that it was his mission to prevent these medicines from becoming available through the public healthcare sector, but also questioned the link between HIV and AIDS and suggested that there was little evidence of an increase in the number of deaths due to HIV. Again, you can go back and you can re-examine the history of what happened in that period. But I'd like to make 2 points. One, I'd like to just talk about what the cost of that level of denialism and disinformation was. But firstly, to talk about how it was spread, because I think it's important to note that in the early 2000s, social media was not yet a major factor. In fact, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube were only launched in 2004, 2005, 2006. So in those early years, disinformation about HIV, misinformation about HIV, a combination of the two, was in fact spread by political influencers, by President Mbeki in particular, by his health minister, Mantu Shabalala Msimang, but also by other members of the African National Congress who were in government at that time, who were fresh as new leaders of a party that had brought about liberation, that commanded extensive respect. And therefore that respect fed into a generalized fear and misunderstanding about HIV and did substantial damage. The damage that it did was on 2 levels. First of all, it created great fear and hesitancy in relation to HIV testing. It reinforced stigmas. And secondly, it delayed the advent of the use of antiretroviral treatment for the prevention of mother-to-child HIV transmission and for the prevention of AIDS. It has been calculated in a peer-reviewed article that as a consequence really of only starting a national treatment program in 2004, that there were 336,000 preventable deaths that can be directly attributed to those delays and to the need to counter a state-sanctioned misinformation campaign about HIV. Underlying that, and I don't have time to go into it, was an active disinformation campaign by people such as Peter Duisberg, David Raznick, Matthias Rath. And I say disinformation because they had material interests in challenging the mainstream understanding of HIV. So that was what happened with HIV, and we live with the legacy and the consequences of that through until till this day. Fast forwarding 20 years to COVID-19, I think the most important difference between COVID-19 and HIV was the revolution in social media and media technology. So that by the time we started to experience disinformation in relation to COVID-19, this time it was not disinformation that was sanctioned by the state. In fact, the South African government made great stress upon the fact that it was following the science. But this time it was spread by an unholy alliance of ill-informed politicians, former politicians, sports people, and other people who were able to use the new forms of social media to create a platform that gave them extensive reach and that fed into fear and fed into vaccine hesitancy. This time, the main arguments were that COVID-19 was grossly exaggerated, that it was not much more than a common flu, that the claims of increased mortality were exaggerated, that there were simple solutions through drugs like ivermectin that were being suppressed by pharmaceutical companies, and then a slew of disinformation about the vaccine itself and the risks of the vaccine that were intended to inject fear into people who were being advised to get vaccinated for COVID-19. I want to finish this point by saying that I think still that there is a need for an examination of communication, of public communication, of media communication around COVID-19, because how we communicate, including how we communicate as so-called experts and so-called scientists, again depends on the degree to which we are listened. And my feeling is that although we followed the medical science in relation to COVID-19, there was very little reference to behavioral science and to social science in terms of effective health messaging and how you counter mis and disinformation. Noting that I'm running out of time, I want to conclude just with one point before summing up, and that is to draw our attention to the, I think, unquantified impact of medical misinformation on a day-to-day basis in South Africa and around the world. There is a very low level of medical and health literacy and health understanding. It means that we have a population that is vulnerable to quackery, and the consequence of that vulnerability is measured in delayed health seeking for appropriate care. It's measured in wasteful personal expenditure amongst people who very often have no or low incomes on vitamins and things that are promoted as remedies and alternative cures to mainstream medicine. And I think this is an area which journalism and people working in health need to do more to examine and to understand. So just in conclusion, we are now in a new era of disinformation. We're in a new era where the leading economy in the world is sanctioning medical disinformation in relation to vaccination, as we're seeing with the measles outbreak in parts of the United States and the role of the new health secretary, RFK Jr. in the United States. And I think one of the questions that we should be asking is, what is the impact of this going to be on Africa and on South Africa? And we should start trying to understand and to analyze and foresee that impact rather than waiting to be caught by surprise. So how should we be responding? I'd identify 5 points. First of all, 3 points to journalists. We need more informed and specialized reporting in relation to health. We need specialized health journalists who are able to analyze and detect right from wrong, misinformation from real information, and are able to write and package it in a way that is accurate. We need to do more to consistently monitor misinformation, and we need to do more to investigate and expose the backstory of those who provide and promote disinformation, so that we can see what are the real agendas that are in fact at play between people who are involved in this space. And finally, I would say that to government, we need to be looking at how do we have more effective public education around health and medical information, and what needs to be done to bring about effective regulation of social digital media in order to prevent the spread of disinformation which causes actual harm. For example, is there a need for a legal prohibition on dangerous, what can be proved to be dangerous disinformation which is harmful to public health? So those are just some things I wanted to put on the table for debate and further thought as this important seminar gets underway. Thank you very much. Thanks, Rebecca.
Great. Thank you, Mark, for that great introduction. And I think the key points there are very accurate about how we need to be training journalists, but also helping identify medical misinformation and informing the public. Kirsten, I hope you don't mind if I ask you to go next, because Carl just had to take an urgent call. Is that okay with you, Kirsten? Kirsten? Sorry, I'm not sure where Kirsten went. She was on screen 1 minute and then she just vanished. Ah, there she is. Kirsten, would you mind going up next? Kirsten is with Africa Check and she's an experienced fact checker. And she'll be providing us with some good insights and tips on how to fact check medical information. Her work focuses on debunking falsehoods, improving accuracy in public debates and in the South African media, and empowering people to navigate a fast evolving digital world. Kirsten, please go ahead. You've got
Thanks.
15 minutes. Christelle will let you know when there's 5 minutes to go. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, will someone give me a thumbs up if you can see this? Or a yes. Okay, cool.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of what I agree is a very important and timely conversation. So we've heard some really fantastic insights about the sort of broader context of false health information as it exists in our current sort of socioeconomic and political moment. But I want to turn to some sort of very practical tips that journalists and others can use in everyday work and life when confronted with health information that needs to be evaluated or verified, or when reporting on a specific piece of research that's been published. So a very brief introduction. I'm from an organization called Africa Check. Our claim to fame is that we're the continent's first independent fact-checking organization. We operate in 4 African countries, and we exist really to sort of promote accuracy and honesty in the public debate and media in Africa. And so we do this through fact-checking work, but also through training, media literacy, and various efforts to foster collaboration among key partners in the media ecosystem in Africa. So let's get right into it. I'm going to go over a sort of few quick tips that you can use in reporting. These are not exhaustive and it's very much just an overview, but I will be sharing some resources that we find helpful in our daily work in terms of, reputable sources to really quickly on the go try and evaluate information. And I'll share these slides with you as well. But so the premise is that if we're doing journalistic work, we need to be able to obviously find a range of different types of evidence, go to statistical bodies, institutions, government agency reports, things like that. But academic research, especially when related to health or medical claims, often requires a much more sort of specialized set of skills to interpret. So the bar for evidence and proving or disproving something becomes a lot higher when we're looking at health claims than some of the other types of information that we come across. And it can be a really difficult process to navigate that without quite specialized skills, right? But there are some things we can do to sort of get started. So I was thinking about what I could fit into such a short presentation that would actually be useful for you to come away with and immediately implement. And I wanted to sort of start that by looking at what the common pitfalls we see in our work are in relation to journalistic reporting. So a lot of journalistic reporting about health tends to fall into these sort of categories, which are also overlapping, but one key point is stretching evidence beyond what a study can actually say. So using the results of a study to say something that is not actually aligned with the study's conclusions, right? Stretching what can be answered from that piece of research. And that often leads to exaggerating or sensationalizing, which I'm sure all familiar with seeing in journalism. And this is very understandable, by the way. You know, time pressure and the strain that news outlets are under, combined with the niche knowledge needed, often makes it really tricky to interpret this kind of information. But another way of looking at this is that it sort of neglects the context, right? This kind of reporting neglects context about study design, you know, sample size, potential biases, various aspects of research that are really, really crucial in understanding what this piece of evidence is actually saying, right? And a lot of this just rests on a sort of lack of scientific literacy about technical terms and statistics in medical research, which then sort of distorts messaging and serves to sort of increase that knowledge gap between science and the public. So what do we do about this? First, I think, is we need to pay more attention to context, right? So if you're a journalist verifying some kind of information, you sort of need to start by breaking it down and looking at what questions you're actually trying to answer, right? And how does the evidence that you're looking at or the particular study that you're looking at fit into the larger body of research on a particular topic? So scientific research obviously isn't published in a vacuum ever, right? It's part of a sort of ecosystem and an interconnected body of literature. So you may not be aware of that surrounding context. So getting to know how this paper fits in with other research is really, really important. You know, is this a study that's confirming previous results? Is it a brand new set of findings? What's actually going on here? Are you looking at, you know, a link between two things? Are you looking at a cause and effect relationship? Are you looking at something that's describing a phenomenon or predicting something? But then context also includes key questions about how the study was disseminated. So who wrote it? What are their affiliations? You know, where is this published? Can you trust the journal? I'll link to a few resources for figuring this out. There isn't really time to go into it now. But that kind of step is often left out. You know, there's this perception that you see the study with, you know, academic jargon and it's published in a journal and it has this sort of prestige. That's not always valid. So I think that's a really important first step that is often left out. And then a second tip is actually figuring out what a study is designed to be able to tell you and what questions it can help answer. So to do this, you need to sort of know a few different types of study that are usually used in this kind of research. So is something just a descriptive study that is describing a phenomenon? You know, these are the features of anxiety in people living with HIV. Is it trying to figure out a link between two factors, right? Is there a link between isolation and depression, for example? Or is it trying to actually make a causal claim, right? Social support reduces depression. And medical research has really, really strict requirements for establishing cause and effect relationships. And you know, often this is talked about in a particular type of study called a randomized controlled trial or RCT. So you'll see that a lot in scientific literature on health topics. And we don't have time to go into that now, but basically that is sort of considered the gold standard for being able to say something about causal relationships. And other types of study can't really say anything about cause and effect. So this is a couple examples of spurious correlations. So this classic problem of correlation doesn't equal causation is still with us. And so these are examples of two things that are very closely linked, very closely correlated, but pretty obviously don't cause one another, right? So worldwide non-commercial space launches correlates with sociology doctorates awarded in the US, for example. So this is, maybe some silly examples, but this is the type of thing that is used in health reporting very commonly, right? And then we also need to look at aspects of study design, like who is in the study. A lot of what we see in our fact-checking work is also, again, stretching the evidence, but particularly in terms of samples. So if you're saying that a piece of research applies to South Africans, but the study that you're looking at was in 20 people in Gauteng, can you really say that this can be generalized and is representative of the entire population? Probably not, right? So something else that's really common in reporting and public's sort of engagement with scientific information in general is a lack of awareness of the sort of strength of evidence. So we've got a little pyramid here, which is, it only sort of applies in this very particular context of research, not in all research, but basically the higher you go on the pyramid here, the sort of stronger the form of evidence is, i.e., the more certain you can be of something like a causal relationship. So what we see at the bottom.
Sorry, 5 minutes.
Thanks. So what we see at the bottom here is we have animal lab studies, and these are almost always in our daily fact-checking work what is used to make claims about health in media. So this is really, really important, right? And these studies are, so either in rats or mice, or in cell studies, right? Just in cells or tissues. And that's really, really important in the research world and is key in, something like developing a new drug. But it isn't really useful in saying anything about cause and effect in a larger sort of population of people, right? So you want to, when looking for evidence, really start at the top of this pyramid and see if there are any meta-analyses or systematic reviews. And these basically summarize and collate and condense all of the available evidence in different ways around a particular topic, and so are much better representation of what's going on with a particular research question than something further down this ladder. So I think in health reporting, it's important to know that this pyramid exists, but also to tell the public that this pyramid exists, right? To say the claim that you're talking about here is using evidence from a study in mice, and this can't be generalized to people for this and this and this reason. So actually making that clear that just because this is a scientific study and it has particular conclusions about this claim doesn't mean that you can sort of definitively claim a much sort of wider, broader, extended conclusion here, right? And if you're unsure about this when reading a study, a good go-to is to sort of read the abstract methods and discussion first to see what sort of kind of study you're looking at. So I think we won't go through an example, but another tip is to sort of commit to spending some time getting to know key concepts in scientific literature. And this can be overwhelming, but there are quite a few quicker ways to get to the basics of what you actually need to know to interpret research. So these are some sort of commonly misinterpreted terms and concepts. Knowing these, honestly, in our fact-checking work, these points that I've listed here are most of the sort of foundation of the false claims that we come across, is misinterpreting that kind of term, right? So we won't go through them now, but a final tip is remembering that you don't have to be the scientist. So if you take one thing away from this, it should be that a lot of the time just speaking to an expert is the answer. Building up a network of experts who you can go to for a particular report is really, really helpful. Expert input will save you time because you don't have to sift through the research in the same way. But it also means you have a sort of voice of authority in your reporting, and it assures quality and avoids these misinterpretations of evidence from you as a non-expert, right? So compiling a list of sources and resources and tools that you trust is also key here. Having that on hand so you can sort of just quickly refer to it on the go is really helpful. And again, I'll link to a few resources that you can use for this. But yeah, this is just a sort of checklist for evaluating health claims, basically just summarizing what I've just spoken about, but looking at breaking down what kind of claim is being made, what are other people saying about it, what are trusted health organizations saying about it. Have I looked widely for evidence about this claim? Have I used lots of different search methods, databases, and terms? Have I relied on trustworthy sources? And what types of research have actually been done on the topic, right? Fitting that into the larger context and fitting that into the evidence pyramid. And what can these study designs actually answer? And then are there independent studies in humans, and what do their samples look like? And then looking at something like clinical trials in some types of health research, knowing what these can and can't say. And then finally, just cross-referencing conclusions with trusted sources again. I know that was very, very rushed, but I hope you have some sort of tips that you can use in your work going forward. And yeah, I'll share this presentation afterwards. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Kirsten. Those are some very helpful tips, especially that pyramid of evidence, I think is really, really important. Next up, we have Carl Dunkel. Carl is a social epidemiologist with 20 years experience in leading and supporting research on the prevention and response to sexual and gender-based violence in South Africa and globally. She's an advocate for evidence-driven programs and policy for improving health outcomes in marginalized communities, especially the LGBTQIA+ communities and people with disabilities. They are public health consultants and an NRF-rated scientist, and they also have been an associate editor for PNC Public Health and PLOS ONE, so they have a great deal of experience in peer review, and they'll be specifically focusing on how to check your sources and identify whether basically to check whether the sources are suitable for providing evidence. Carl, if you can, do you want to share your slides?
So from my side, it looks like the slides are shared. Can you confirm if they are from your side?
I can't see them. Can anyone else see them?
No.
I can also share from my screen if need be.
All right, let me try sharing in a slightly different way then. How's that?
Oh.
I can't see them.
Still not.
Um,
All right.
No,
Third
I'm
time
not
lucky.
sharing.
Or are you going to share them, Rebecca?
Yes, I'm going to share them.
All right.
Can you see them now?
Yeah, I
Okay.
can see them now.
Okay, let me just
If you can start it as a slideshow.
Yep, I'm busy doing that. Let me see.
Okay,
Is
great.
it showing? Okay, great.
So
Can everybody see?
Yeah.
Can someone give a thumbs up?
Lots of thumbs up. Okay, great.
Okay, great.
So I apologize that I had to step out when it was my actual turn, but I think this was perhaps a bit of good serendipity, because I'm kind of picking up where Kirsten left off, which is I want to speak as a scientist about how we check other scientists and try and give you some of the insider track on how you can discern if your expert is actually an expert, and what some of your red flags will be on whether or not somebody is a reliable scientific source. Next slide, please.
I'm trying to. It doesn't want to let me. Oh dear. It doesn't want to let me move on the slides. There we go. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is to really underline that there are different kinds of expertise that are really valuable for medical and health reporting. And I'm going to focus today on scientific and medical expertise, which can obviously be verified in a range of different ways, from checking somebody's formal education, training, certifications, their expertise gained from their research output track record, and that'll usually be best reflected in their peer-reviewed outputs on the topic in question. I don't want us to discount the expertise of lived experience, which can sometimes be at odds with what scientific experts are claiming, and the importance of including the perspectives of people who are directly affected by a health issue for ethical reporting and to complement your expert opinion. Your ideal source, of course, is always going to be somebody who's directly part of the population or directly affected by a health issue under study, and who also has relevant scientific expertise. And my image here is reaffirming the principle of nothing about us without us, which of course emerged from the disability rights movement, which is why it's a line drawing of people with disabilities, but does apply to a range of other populations. Next slide, please. So let's talk about what might go wrong with your scientific and medical experts, and then I'll circle back around to this at the end after I sort of talk about how you can verify your person is an expert. So obviously, bad actors can just straight up lie to you. But more commonly, what you'll get with people claiming scientific credentials when things goes awry, and Mark spoke to this a little bit, is they're either exaggerating or misrepresenting their expertise. We're all human as scientists. People can be genuinely unaware of their limits, or just simply not very skillful or very good at science. Having been interviewed by journalists on a number of occasions, I can confirm that scientists often like to hedge our bets and be very cautious and claim things in a very conditioned way that doesn't fit well with headlines. And unless your scientist has had media training, you might push them into overclaiming. So that's just something to be aware of. But where you're most likely to get into particularly disinformation and malinformation from a scientific source is somebody who is out of their lane, who has real credentials, but is speaking outside their expertise and sort of using their valid credentials to push an agenda on an unrelated topic. Next slide. So some of your red flags for whether or not this is happening is somebody who has credentials in one area, but they're speaking in another. And in particular, if they don't have any peer-reviewed publications or other peer-reviewed outputs on the topic that they're trying to comment on, you've probably got a problem. If they're leaning heavily on their degrees and don't have research or directly relevant clinical experience and engagement with the population they want to talk about, if they're getting into a whole victim narrative and claiming that science is broken or corrupted and everybody but me is doing it wrong, that should be a red flag. And in particular, if you start your vetting with a generic web search of what this person is up to, and you see that they're showing up on op-ed pages, in the media, in political forums, in religious forums, in non-scientific forums, far more than they're showing up in academic forums, that's going to be a huge red flag that this is probably a bad actor. Next flag or slide. So I'm going to assume that folks know how to do this, but just to say, helps to check people's medical licensing. In South Africa, you can do it on the HPCSA iRegister. Just make sure that you use wildcards for names because spelling can be a problem. If you're in the USA, search by state. Otherwise, Google knows how to do it. Next slide. So let's talk about checking for scholarly output and where to go and what are good and not so good sources. Google Scholar, it's free, it's broad, and I'll show you just now some of the citation metrics that it produces. It also pops right up a co-author list so you can see who this person collaborates with, and if necessary, see if there's any red flags there. PubMed tends to focus on biomedical and health research only, but it's a great source. ResearchGate and academia.edu are more social networky. Not everybody actually engages them or has picked up their profile on these sites. So if somebody's not on it, that is not a red flag. But if they are on it, it's another way of verifying their publications and their networks. And a really useful thing to know about is these ORC IDs that those of us who are research active get. These were started in about 2012, and everybody basically gets their own URL and code number that's tied specifically to them and verified, and that's really useful for disambiguation. Yes, I can speak English. If multiple people have the same name or similar names, and a lot of academic journals will publish people's ORC IDs or ORC IDs or orchids, we call them a lot of things, alongside their names. So that can be another really useful way to figure out who's who. Institutional websites, I would not necessarily rely on for anything other than verifying employment history. I have a lot of institutions I was previously associated with where you can still find me because they don't update, but very few people keep their research outputs up to date on those, even if there's a thing that says it's a list of research output. Don't trust the institutional websites, but Google Scholar emails me almost every week to say, we found something new, did you write it? And a lot of people keep track of that. So next slide. So let's talk now a little bit about the quality. So I'm going to talk, we could talk for hours about the problems with peer review, but it's still the best tool we have. So what counts as quality are peer-reviewed outputs, and those will normally be peer-reviewed journal articles. They can also be peer-reviewed conference presentations, particularly if somebody is presenting at, say, the International AIDS Conference. What you want to look at with COB's conference presentations is this in an abstract-driven session? That's going to be your code word for this person had to submit a written product ahead of time that was subjected to peer review before they were allowed to present at the conference. Otherwise, you can have other kinds of presentations. If you have technical reports produced by, for example, like the Medical Research Council, Burden of Disease Unit will produce technical reports. Those are always peer reviewed. They'll name who the peer reviewers are. If you're seeing a product like that, that's fine. Some government agencies in some countries will produce reports with a rigorous apolitical technical review. Until January, that was the case with some US outputs. You can probably tell from the accent, I feel no obligation to hold anything back criticizing my country of birth, if not my current country. Do not trust anything put out by the US federal government for the foreseeable future. I'm just going to say that as a rule. Nothing that comes out of a US agency is scientific until further notice. I'm just going to say that. Some books from academic presses are peer-reviewed, but that's more common in the humanities. One thing you really need to be aware of is just because something is in a respected peer-reviewed academic journal that's properly indexed does not mean that specific content was peer-reviewed, and you will definitely see bad actors who are going to inflate and conflate this for you. So let's go to the next slide and talk about that. So content in peer-reviewed journals that might not have actually been reviewed. And I'm teeing something up for Ingrid, who's speaking in the next session. If it's a commissioned piece, it may not go out for review, it might not. If it's author-initiated commentary, perspective, viewpoint, editorial, that's more likely to be peer-reviewed, but not always. Similarly for educational or instructional articles or blog posts. Things that will almost never have been peer-reviewed, only a very small number of journals will do this, will be editorials, opinion pieces, think pieces, letters to the editor and author replies that are correspondence subsequent to an article being published, news, obituaries, book product reviews. That stuff does not go out for peer review. So if somebody has managed to get a letter to the editor or an opinion piece in a journal, but is now telling you they have a peer-reviewed publication, that's deliberate disinformation and they're inflating something. You'll find all kinds of stuff online.
5 minutes, Kyle.
Okay, you'll find all kinds of stuff online about how to look at an article. The real way to do this is you look at the publication and you go to the journal policy. And it'll tell you what they do and don't peer review. Next. I think let's skip this. If people want to understand in the Q&A how peer review works, we can talk about it. Just know that there's a lot of unpaid volunteer work that goes into it and it complicates the process. Next. Okay, predatory journals arose because digital publishing created a lot of space for low-cost operations, and a lot of government-funded research started requiring scientists to publish open access so that taxpayers could access the science they paid for. That created a perfect storm. In South Africa, the Department of Higher Education and Training publishes lists of journals that they think are acceptable every year. That's as good a source as any to check for whether or not a given publication in a given year was acceptable. Next. And then this is just to say we all get bombarded by academic spam, and a colleague of mine used to collect it and turn it into memes. But if you are a researcher and get stuff that looks like that, not cool. Next. I also just want to talk briefly about author position and what it means, because as a journalist, you'll typically be talking to the person, if you're looking at an article, who has the asterisk that says the corresponding author. This is usually the first author who generally did the majority of the work, a last author who is typically a senior person, unless it's a social science paper, in which case that might not apply. But for medical research, normally you have the biggest contributor, the second biggest contributor, and then the senior person in charge is the last person. Doesn't matter if your corresponding author is first, second, last, or someone else. That's the person that you're going to engage with about the article, unless that person directs you to somebody else. Next slide. So, citation metrics. These can apply to journals, to researchers, or to articles, and they're just really, we could talk a lot about them and how problematically they're used in careers. From a journalist perspective, I would say it gives you an idea of how much other scientists think this particular product is worth. So a journal impact factor, they need to be compared with in-field, but as a rule of thumb, if it's over 2 and it's not fake, it's fine. If it's over 5, you have an amazing journal. If it's a lot over 5, it's probably Science, Nature, or The Lancet. For individual researchers, we get these things called an H index. So this happens to be my metrics. And so this is telling you that since 2020, I've had 40 publications that have been cited at least 40 times. I've had 91 publications that have been cited at least 10 times, and that's the I-10 index. Dimensions and alt metrics are newer metrics that track papers. These are metrics from a paper that I wrote, which show you how many total. The dimensions badge shows you how many times it's been cited in scientific work, but it includes grant proposals, policies, and so on and so forth. A relative citation ratio over 1 tells you it's being cited more often than other work on that topic. Your alt metrics are starting to include blue sky as people migrate over from X, but it shows you where you've gotten public engagement with the article on socials. Next. Next, please.
I don't know why it's not. Oh, there we go.
Okay. So national and regional recognition. There's a whole bunch of academies of science I've highlighted for you here. If somebody's a member, it's super prestigious. In South Africa, we have this thing called the NRF. And the thing to know about the NRF ratings is if somebody has a rating, it's a really good sign that other people think they're good at research. But if they don't have a rating, it might just mean that their employment wasn't eligible or they don't have the right kind of contract because there's really limited eligibility. So I happened to be eligible a couple of years ago, so I'm just showing you mine to see the kind of information you get. A C is a sort of this person's cool rating. It's not amazing, but it's fine. It means, yes, I'm a scientist and I know what I'm doing. What is useful and what is really helpful for watching for people getting out of their lane in this country is if somebody has a rating, it tells you what fields they're expert in and where their expertise is acknowledged. So if they're speaking outside of the listed topics, that's a major red flag. Okay. And you just download that spreadsheet from NRF. So some more red flags that you are being bamboozled. If somebody's using their science to push personal, moral, or religious belief, if they are dismissing or demonizing people and evidence that don't support whatever view they're promoting, if they're playing a victim card about how they're being silenced, it usually means their work won't tolerate peer review. If they are affiliated with or quote ideological think tanks, hate groups, masquerading as science, Ingrid will talk about that next session, or disinformation outlets, pushing sensational narratives. I told you scientists tend to be really cautious. If somebody's out there talking in very dramatic language, that should be a red flag for a scientific source. And if they're only interested in people or case studies that reinforce their beliefs. Another huge red flag for me, and I would hope for all of you, because health issues are social justice issues, if this person cannot articulate how they engage with and hold themselves accountable to patient and community groups that are affected by or involved with their work and views, that is a major red flag. Or if they're only talking about a tiny minority of cases that happen to reinforce their non-consensus point, and they want to tell you that everybody else is a radical, horrible person, also a red flag. Somebody who's really engaged will have a tolerance for disagreement and will respect people who disagree with them and explain with evidence why they think what they think. Next, and I think it'll be the end.
Time is up, Kyle.
Yeah. So these were just some quick checklists. Questions that I wanted to suggest that you should check before you decide your expert is cool or not.
Sorry about that. Okay.
No worries.
That just jumping from one screen to the other. Great, Carl. Those are all fantastic tips. And we will now be moving on to Natasha, who will be giving us an insight into how, what does good medical reporting look like? Natasha is a lecturer at the University of Adelaide School of Psychology, and she's interested in the use of interdisciplinary and systems thinking approaches to encourage constructive responses to societal changes. Her research investigates the role of news media in misinformation and the influence of constructive journalism on trust, beliefs, and emotions using mixed methods. Natasha, you have 15 minutes, and Crystal will let you know periodically when your time is running out. If you can go right ahead and share your camera and mic.
No problem. Thank you very much. Is it all right if I also share my screen?
Are you able to do so? Yes,
I
great,
think so.
fantastic.
Yes.
Yes, we can see
Wonderful.
that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yes, so my presentation will be hopefully bringing together a number of the threads that have already been started, but it is a fair bit broader. So I'll be talking about an approach that draws on psychology and behavioral science to think about how journalists go about reporting the news and what techniques they can use to address some of the common criticisms that news gets both from audiences and also from academics and even journalists themselves about news perpetuating misinformation or sort of unhelpful responses to health and broader problems. I'll just also start by acknowledging that I'm in Australia, so I'm giving this talk and I live and work on the lands of the Kaurna people, who are the traditional custodians of the Adelaide Plains. So I'll start by just overviewing what I mean when I'm talking about constructive journalism and also a little bit of the motivations that led it to be developed. Then I'll also do a bit of a case study on how journalists made use of this approach during COVID-19 to encourage more responsible health reporting. And then I'll also talk about a training course that we've put together for journalists to be able to use to learn these techniques and implement them in their own reporting. So in terms of why this approach sort of started, I think Mark already talked about this a fair bit, and Kirsten a little bit too. There's been a sort of global decline in trust in news. Across the globe, the average trust in news by the Reuters Digital Report is 40% for news in general. It goes slightly up to 46% for people's own news that they use. In Australia, where I am, it's about 43%, and in South Africa, you're a bit higher at 57%. But you actually are highest in terms of people who responded to this survey on concern about discerning true from false information. So this has been something that's also been a concern in terms of how much people are avoiding the news. So globally, there's also been an increase in people avoiding the news, which also becomes a problem because the more people avoid the news, the more likely they are to turn to alternative sources that may perpetuate mis or disinformation. But when it comes to news avoidance, some of the key reasons are that it has a negative effect on people's mood, that they feel worn out by it, they feel like it is untrustworthy and biased, and also that they just can't do anything about all the problems that have been presented in the news. So in response to this, constructive journalism was really thinking about how can we change some of the ways that we're doing news to be more responsible and conscious, and think about, we have all of this knowledge from psychology and behavioral sciences now about how people are responding to information. Can we implement that to develop some techniques that are actually going, well, given we know this, should we start looking at how we're producing news and the effect that that's having on people in terms of developing misperceptions or getting essentially very skewed views that the world is a lot more dangerous in some cases, or in some cases that developments are 50 years behind what they actually are. So there's sort of two sides to constructive journalism. The first of these is more of a principles and mindset approach. So I've taken this from a Danish institute that's dedicated to constructive journalism, and this sort of talks about this idea of focusing on solutions, covering nuances, and promoting democratic conversation. And these have also been passed out into 6 elements or techniques that journalists can use in their reporting. So the first of these is looking at reporting on solutions. So when there are problems, are there people that are doing things about them? How well are those solutions working? So really getting that evaluation, and also thinking about, can those solutions be applied elsewhere? There's also future orientation. So thinking about what are some potential pathways forward, what would be needed to get them there. And context is also a really important one. So I think this touches on some things that Kirsten was saying. A lot of the time, reporting can be very episodic, and even though it's technically factually accurate, the overall perception that gets left is different from what the sort of initial evidence was perhaps saying, or different from what we actually see if we step out and include more context. So this is things like reporting on trends over time, or also providing a little bit more detail on, okay, if you have this statistic of say 57%, what actually went behind it to get that information, and what does that mean? It also includes inclusiveness and diversity. So this includes making sure that coverage is not polarized, so looking at moving away from sort of heavy conflict laden to actually getting more productive conversation, even if it's from different viewpoints. And it also looks at getting a wider variety of sources. So rather than sort of going to traditional sources that might be really easy to think of and contact, actually going what voices are being excluded from news and how can we start bringing them in. It also looks at empowering people. So part of this is also, I think, touching on what Carl was saying about how experts get interviewed even. So rather than sort of those very leading questions, thinking about what sort of questions can you ask that allow the expert to actually talk about their knowledge, and also asking them things that allow them to talk about potential resources, solutions, collaborations, alongside talking about the problems and what's going wrong. And then finally, co-creation, working with audiences to know what do they actually need from news for it to be effective for them, and also thinking about working potentially with people, particularly in health and medical reporting. Can you work with experts to create stories? Can you also work with people with lived experience to create stories that better represent them? In terms of health reporting specifically, this becomes really useful in this field because news media tends to be a really key source of people getting a lot of public information about health institutions, health conditions, and how they can manage their healthcare. But there's been a lot of academic critique of news and lay audience critique as well, in that it tends to lack accuracy and context. So again, having very episodic reporting a lot of the time. It often has imbalanced sourcing practices, so tends to lean heavily on some sources, sometimes unreliable sources. It rarely reports on the social determinants of health. So often this tends to lead to an individualistic frame of responsibility for health conditions, which can result in a lot of stigma. And that stigmatizing coverage can be particularly the case for conditions like severe mental illness or obesity. So when we're looking at those constructive techniques, they share a lot of overlap with reporting guidelines for different health conditions. I've linked to a couple of them here for mental illness at Mindframe and obesity at the Obesity Collective. Essentially things like including context, reporting responsibly, empowering people, co-creating stories, talking about hope and recovery, having non-stereotypical portrayals of illness, so people aren't kind of getting the sense that this is the only way that this particular health condition presents. And also looking at how do we actually go about the process of selecting which health story we decide is worth reporting on and which angle do we take on that health story, and how does that fit into the broader narratives that people are developing about these health conditions, because those broader narratives can also influence how much people take on individual pieces of misinformation and view them as believable too. And finally, reporting on those social determinants of health. So that's sort of a broad overview of what constructive journalism is and how it applies to health reporting. During COVID-19, I interviewed 11 journalists around how they were using constructive journalism in the context of COVID-19. This was quite early stages, so from March to April in 2020. And the journalists came from a range of continents, so they were in Europe, Oceania, Africa, and North America. And we talked about the role of journalism and what they thought that was in COVID-19, and then how they were using constructive journalism or how they thought it could be helpful when reporting on COVID-19 and thinking about public understanding in that context. I can talk more about the methods if anyone's interested in the Q&A, but essentially this came out to two separate theme groups. I'll just flick to the slide with some extracts so you can read them as I'm talking if you'd like to. But essentially on one side, it was this idea of sober, not sensational reporting. So when they were sort of thinking about how can I report responsibly on this, a lot of them were talking about, well, we had a really educational role in this context. There was a lot of health information that people had to get and digest, and they really needed to go, well, how can we take this information from experts and this information that's constantly changing and give it to people in a way that's understandable, that's digestible, and that's not sort of drumming up a lot of anxiety and sort of fear that's not actually helpful. So part of this was thinking about going beyond the numbers. So rather than just reporting statistics, actually explaining how did these statistics come about, what was going into them, what does this actually mean, and also thinking about that broader context behind those statistics as well, in terms of sort of situating that within, for example, population rates, or for example, when it came to things like vaccines at future times, thinking about when you're reporting, oh, XYZ people who are vaccinated got COVID, how do you put that into perspective in terms of the proportions of people vaccinated versus unvaccinated? They were also talking about slower reporting. So because especially with that sort of increase of digital technology and being able to have moment by moment reporting, how do you actually go about giving people information in a form that they can understand and not just kind of constant updates that could make people quite stressed and leave them not actually able to follow what was happening because they were getting these episodic chunks that weren't necessarily fitting into a cohesive story. And this also tied into this idea of understanding uncertainty and conveying that to the public in a way that was helpful, rather than sort of saying scientists have said this one day and now they're saying this the next day, but instead being able to convey this is why we have uncertainty around these estimates, this is sort of the best that we can do at this time. And finally, there was solutions in this theme as well. And so here it was looking at what sort of solutions can be reported, what's the evidence for them, so making sure that any solutions they reported had a really strong evidence base to the extent that they could at the time. And it also meant looking at things like if there are countries or regions that have really low infection rates, what are they doing that's leading to that? And are there things from that that we could take and implement there? And then on the other side, we had what's positive in a pandemic, and this was much more about how could journalism help to encourage collective action. So if we're thinking about a time where people are very stressed and where there's also a lot of need for people to comply with public guidelines around health, what could journalism be doing to encourage that sense of solidarity rather than increasing that sense of polarization? So some of this was reporting with empathy and also looking at what can they do to sort of encourage stories that help people to see connection between different groups and also encourage constructive responses in the sense of if you're sort of following these guidelines, how is that helping people as a collective? It was also thinking about where are there stories of things that are going well in the pandemic that can help people to sort of maintain a sense of hope during this time.
5 minutes, Natasha.
Perfect, thank you. So in terms of sort of key takeaways, the journalists overall found that using these constructive approaches was helpful for them in reducing mental health burden, both on audiences and also in some cases for themselves. They also thought it was helpful for increasing trust and informativeness, and they thought it was helpful for encouraging constructive behaviour. I'll just flag, given we're talking about qualities of evidence, this can't be causal evidence that constructive journalism actually does these things, but it was sort of things that the journalists were experiencing as helpful in their practice at the time. So the final part that I'll talk about is constructive journalism training. So as a bit of a follow-up to some of this work, we've been doing work around constructive journalism and health reporting more broadly, and part of this has been developing a constructive journalism toolkit. So it's a short online course of about 8 modules that gives you an introduction into constructive journalism as an approach, what's some of the history, how does it fit with some of the journalism principles like objectivity, for example, and then steps through each of those 6 elements or techniques that I mentioned, including very practical steps of how would you actually go about implementing this, and some interviews with experts and journalists who are using these approaches on how they kind of go about doing so. And it also has a resources module, which includes things like how do you report on health statistics, for example, or links to those guidelines like the ones that I mentioned earlier on the slide. So it's very much geared towards sort of professional journalists and trying to encourage them to think about how could they use these techniques in their own reporting practices. We did a bit of an evaluation around this. I didn't include the sort of quantitative side of it. This was just some qualitative feedback more if this is a resource that you think would be helpful. You can see some of the comments on things that some journalists found useful in it. One of the things that I think wasn't mentioned here was still the difficulty, which I think is a common problem with constructive journalism, of how do you actually then implement it if editors aren't on board. So some of the journalists said that they were able to use it straight away in stories that they were doing, whereas others said, I love the idea of it, but I don't know how much of it I could actually do without my editor's consent. So that's kind of a common difficulty there, but it's still, we found that overall the participants who went through our evaluation found it quite helpful. And then just finally, we also wanted to see how audiences actually responded to constructive versus non-constructive health stories. In this particular instance, we were looking at things like mood, trust, and stigma, particularly because mood and trust are relevant to how much people are actually willing to engage with news media, which again plays an important role in how much they're being informed by health news as opposed to potentially going to other sources. And we found that across heart disease, obesity, and mental illness, they did report more positive mood after viewing the constructive relative to sort of more traditionally framed articles. And we also found that they reported more positive feelings towards people with each of those health conditions, so less effective stigma. We did find an increase in trust across 2 of the experiments. You'll notice it's a bit smaller. Trust tends to be a little bit harder to move a lot of the time. But generally there was sort of a higher trust for the constructive compared to the traditionally framed articles. So overall, it sort of seemed that it was promising in terms of the audience approach and the journalist approach as well. But just as some conclusions, one of the main incentives for sort of constructive journalism, and one of the things that I'm interested in the context of misinformation, is that misinformation can be perpetuated by what's not reported as well as what's reported and what receives undue attention. And part of this is sort of the narratives about health that people can develop from reading episodic stories a lot of the time without some of this broader context, or updates about developments that have happened within health. So constructive journalism is really looking at, can we address some of that, and also address some of these dissatisfactions that people have with news in a way that helps them to engage with it more so. And then during the pandemic, journalists found that it was generally useful using constructive journalism, and it helped them to think about how could they be more responsible in their role as a journalist. And then finally, just if you're interested in using the training course or having a look at it, feel free to reach out to me. I'm very happy to share it on request. And there's references if you want. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Natasha. That was absolutely great. And I think that this constructive journalism is an example of how we can move forward for addressing misinformation. We're running a little bit late, as we're supposed to wrap up in 8 minutes. But if there is any questions, can you raise your hands, and then I will call on you according to how the order that I see hands raised in. Does anyone have any questions? No? Okay. Well, then I would like to thank everybody for coming, and thanks to our fantastic speakers who've given us some really great insights into how to report accurately on medical journalism. Thank you for attending. The next one will be coming up in May. Keep an eye on your social media. We will be also sending everybody who attended this webinar, we will notify you of the next one. The next webinar is particularly focused on accurate reporting of transgender care, because we found that there's a lot of problems with how transgender issues are being reported, and a lot of misinformation in that regard. So we'll be giving that a focus in the next webinar. The following one after that, we'll be looking at vaccine misinformation. As I'm sure you're aware that vaccine misinformation is a growing cause of concern. The World Health Organization has recognized it as a key public health issue. So we'll be tackling that in the third webinar. And the final webinar, we'll be looking at topics around sexual health, especially in South Africa and especially among young people, but not exclusively, and looking at the role that media can play in promoting healthy sexual behavior. Great, thanks everybody. Have a good day further.